And today we're going to be talking about how things breathe. And you might kind of think that, well, everything breathes like we breathe. And that's, yeah, some things do and some things don't. It's amazing to realize what kind of adaptations different kinds of animals have just to get air in and to keep their body processes going. Now, the basic idea of breathing, of course, is that all these things that happen within a human, or not just human, but a living body, require energy. And the energy that it gets, that a human body or a living body gets, comes partially from, well, you might think of getting energy from your food and things like that, but in order to get any benefit from that, you have to have a chemical reaction going on. The chemical reaction is oxidation. And all the energy that powers everything that happens in a living body comes from, well, pretty much every living body, unless you're something like an anaerobic bacterium. But for anything above that, it comes from oxidation, which means you have to get oxygen into your body. It has to be distributed throughout your body through all your cells, which happens through the circulatory system. And the oxygen has to get into the cells, and there the oxidation takes place, and it's an exothermic reaction. It gives off energy, and that's what powers everything that happens in a living body. And various different kinds of organisms have different kinds of structures and processes to allow that to happen. And I'm going to talk about just a few of them today, but one that I really want to talk about is the way birds breathe, the way birds take in oxygen and exhale exhaust gases, particularly for carbon dioxide. Let's start. I'm going to talk about reptiles, just as an example. Now, reptiles don't have something that we have. We and other mammals have something called a diaphragm. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But this little guy, who is a bearded dragon native to Australia, does not have a diaphragm. And most reptiles, there's a few crocodiles, alligators, things like that, that do have somewhat of a diaphragm. It works a little differently from our diaphragm. But this guy doesn't have one. And I don't know if you can see it right now, but he's breathing, taking in oxygen, taking in air, and exhaling, inhaling, exhaling. But it all happens because his rib cage is expanding and contracting, which works pretty well. Unless this animal has to run, because all those muscles along its body that it uses to expand its rib cage and contract its rib cage are also used in running. So an animal like this, when it tries to run, has to hold its breath. So it can't run very far. And it can't, you know, it can maybe scuttle pretty fast for a few feet for a little while, but not for long. Now, to overcome that, some reptiles have something they call buccal breathing. That's, don't move. That's, get a better dry erase marker. That's B-U-C-C-A-L, buccal breathing. And by that, they draw in air through the nostrils, and it goes down into their mouth very easily because most reptiles don't have what's called a secondary palate. And the secondary palate separates the nose, the nasal cavity, and the mouth cavity. Reptiles don't have that, so the air goes right into their mouth, and they can expand their throat muscles and take in a big gulp of air that way, and then squeeze it down into their lungs, especially when they're running. And that helps them to get some air into their lungs when they're using all their running muscles that interfere with breathing, interfere with expanding and contracting their rib cage. So they have some adaptations that maybe not as efficient as some others, but works pretty well. But in the case of reptiles, the air goes in and back out, in and back out. It goes one direction in, one direction out. And that's different from the way some other animals do it. So let's put this guy back in the box. There you go. Mammals have a diaphragm. We have a big sheet of muscle. Here's part of it on this model, right here, above the abdominal cavity, and below, between the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity, where the heart and the lungs are. And you can see it a little bit better on this chunk of model here. This big muscle here, the organs of the abdominal cavity would go here, liver, stomach, pancreas, all those things would go here. Heart and lungs above it, And what that does, of course, when we breathe, we don't draw in air, we simply make more space. And air pressure forces air in to this space here. When you open up this cavity, make the cavity larger, it gives more room for air to come in, and air is forced in through regular atmospheric pressure. And it works pretty well. We have, I tried to diagram this a few minutes ago. I was going to draw all this out on the board. I started drawing and it was so bad. I said, no way, that nobody can tell anything from this because I'm so bad at drawing. But when we draw in air, it goes through bronchial tube, it goes into the tiniest tubes, tinier tubes, and finally goes into the stuff that's in the lungs. The lungs are pretty much made up of little tiny air sacs called alveoli. And there's maybe a tube coming in here, and air gets into the alveoli, and the walls of the alveoli are very, very thin, just a couple of cells thin. And they are webbed with capillaries, with very, very tiny blood vessels, and oxygen can transfer through those membranes, through the cell walls, into the blood vessels and get into the blood. And that feeds oxygen to our entire body through the circulatory system. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about birds is because they're so special. They have amazing respiratory systems that allows them to take in so much oxygen they can actually fly. They can fly at high altitudes. They can fly very fast. A duck might fly, or a pigeon might fly 60 miles an hour. Some geese fly over the top of Mount Everest. That's around 30,000 feet above sea level. And that's an environment in which we couldn't survive at all. It wouldn't work at all for us. But birds have a respiratory system that allows them to take in air and not push it back out the same way. They can inhale and exhale at the same time, which is really wild. Now, like I say, I'm really bad at drawing. I copied some schematic drawings here, and I'm not sure what you can see from them, but I'm going to try to explain this. What happens is the lungs in a bird don't expand and contract. They pretty much stay still. And they don't have little air sacs in them either. They have little tubes that are lined with twice. And when a bird inhales, the air goes down the trachea, and it divides. When it gets to about the lungs, it divides into two channels. One of the channels does go to the lungs, so some air gets to the lungs, and gas exchange happens there. Oxygen starts going into blood, and it's picking up carbon dioxide from the blood there that's deoxygenated, and that gets exhaled. But most of the air goes into air sacs. And this is just a little schematic, gives you the basic idea. This is maybe a little bit better. A lot of the space inside a bird is taken up with air sacs. And the air flows into what's called the posterior air sacs. That means that posterior means at the back. So it goes into posterior air sacs, and that fills up with air. So air is in the lungs, it's exchanging gases, it's giving oxygen to the blood, taking carbon dioxide from the blood, and it's pretty much exhausted then. It's stale air, and it needs to get out. So what happens then is the air sac, the posterior air sac, contracts and pushes the fresh air it had in there into the lungs. That pushes the stale air out, and it goes out through the trachea. And so that's one inhalation, one exhalation. But after the first exhalation, when all that stale air in the lungs gets out, the air that comes from the posterior air sacs is still in the lungs. So it's exhaling and inhaling that air from the posterior air sacs at the same time. And then that's doing the whole gas exchange thing there. But then the bird also inhales again, and air comes into the air sacs, the posterior air sacs again, fills them up. They're ready to exchange, to put some fresh air into the lungs. But there's still stale air in the lungs, and it can't get out because the bird's already inhaling more in the trachea. So it goes into anterior. That is pushed out into anterior air sacs. And that means that air can get into the lungs, it can get into the posterior air sacs, and then it exhales again, and the air in the anterior air sacs gets forced out through the trachea. The air in the lungs gets forced into the anterior air sacs, and the air in the posterior air sacs goes into the lungs. So the lungs don't expand and contract. The lungs absorb and give up, exchange gases, but it kind of has this circular system. It goes into the posterior air sacs and into the lungs, and then what's in the lungs goes into the anterior air sacs, and that gets forced out, and more gets pulled into the posterior air sacs, and it's circular breathing. They keep going circular and circular. So while air is being forced out, more air is coming in. They never have a time when they're inhaled and the air stays there and then goes back out, and then they have to pull in more. It's always flowing constantly through a bird's lungs with those air sacs. And the air sacs in this diagram are very simple. This is another diagram that shows a little bit more complex diagram of it. But it's actually much more complicated than that. It uses the space inside a bird very efficiently. Some of it actually gets some of the anterior air sacs that store air ready to be exhaled can be in bones. They're hollow bones. There are spaces around the clavicle. There's spaces in the front of the bird and at the top of what we would consider the breast of the bird that are filled with air ready to be expelled. So the air comes in. Some of the air goes to the lungs, so the lungs are never without air, but most of it goes into the posterior air sacs, and that gets forced into the lungs, forcing the old air out, giving the lungs more gas to exchange, and the gas that gets forced out is breathed out, but then more air is coming in. The gas that's in the lungs can't be exhaled when other air is coming in the front, so it goes into the anterior air sacs. Keeps going like that. Keeps going like that, keeps going like that, never stops, never backs up. It's an amazing system that allows birds to fly. You see some of these old ideas in the Greek mythology with somebody, making wings for themselves and flapping their arms and flying and things like that. No, we're not designed for that. We can't do that. We don't have the lung capacity. We don't have the muscles for it. Birds are just fantastically designed to do what they do. Well, that's the main idea I wanted to get across today, just that things are so incredibly designed for what they do. Like the lizards, even though they're not very efficiently designed for things like running, they can take in air through their nose and squeeze it out of their mouth, take a big gulp of it. You might have seen that in frogs. You ever seen a frog blow up its throat like that, and then the throat contracts? It's doing that. It's bringing in air, blowing up the throat, forcing it into their lungs, and can exhale back out again. Same thing with lizards. If lizards have to get from one place to another fast, got to get away from danger or something like that, and they got to, they're starting to get short on air. Many of them anyway, can take in air and fill up their throat and mouth and force it into their lungs, even though those breathing muscles are being occupied and running. Of course, mammals, well, we all know a lot about that because we're mammals. We've got that diaphragm working for us all the time. But in a way, it's less efficient than a bird system because when we inhale and we exhale, some of the old air never gets out. We still have this kind of constant content of stale air in our lungs that we never really quite exhale. And that's why a lot of people say, well, you're trying to get used to altitude. Like guides will tell you if you're hiking in the mountains or something, you're at a high altitude and you feel short of breath, you really can't, you feel like you have to inhale and inhale and inhale. The people that know what they're doing say, no, exhale. Get all the old air out, and that will let you get more air in and improve your gas exchange. Because, some of our old air is always in our lungs. Not as efficient as some other animals, but, well, maybe we have some other things to compensate for that. And of course, birds, they're the breathing champions of the world. Well, that's about all I had to talk about today. So next time you're out and you see an osprey cruising around the lakeshore looking for fish, or you see an eagle flying, or just a red-winged blackbird being really active, or the wrens and the chickadees and things in your backyard around the bird feeder, wow, think of all that energy they're expending. think of all that, you know, they have to eat a lot, but they also have to breathe a lot to make that happen. It's an amazing thing happening right there. That's all I have to say for this afternoon.